Hello and welcome to the Essex Book Festival podcast. My name is Daisy and I'm going to be speaking to some of the people behind this year's festival. My guest today is a TV historian and writer who's explored everything from Jack the Ripper to Neville Staple and the Knights Templar, and will be joining the Essex Book Festival at Layer Marney Tower on the 28th of June. Please welcome Tony McMahon.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Well, I'm glad to be. I'm delighted to be speaking at the festival because I'm basically an Essex boy. A real bona fide. Yeah, I was born in Walthamstow. We didn't spend long there. I grew up mainly in Woodford Green, which I'm sure many people know. It's a station on the Central Line, and I went to school in Chigwell, Buckhurst Hill County High. No longer exists, unfortunately, boys' grammar school in Chigwell. And my whole childhood and youth was spent in places like Loughton, Buckhurst Hill, Chigwell, basically, everywhere you can find at the end of the Central Line, plus, the interior of Essex, which, as we know, is rich in history.
Yes, and we're going to be speaking about that. We're really excited that you're going to be with us and you're going to be talking about your latest book, The Downfall of the Templars. We'll speak a bit more about the book in a little minute, but first, tell us just a bit about yourself. You've done a lot of stuff, a lot of writing.
Yeah, I mean, my background actually, I was originally a journalist, I was a print journalist, and then I became a BBC news producer for many years. I've been kind of involved in basic corporate PR. I did because I sold out and went for the money in PR. And then actually, I spent 10 years working in counter-terrorism, counter-extremism programs, something completely different, although weirdly kind of related to the Templars because the kind of misuse of history by different groups is, well, as we know, that is going on. But then, yeah, I have written several books. I started out with biographies because as a former journalist, biographies are kind of an extended form of journalism in a way. You're kind of like investigating, you're getting under the skin of people. And I did a boxer called Errol Christie. No Place to Hide was the book that was put up for a couple of awards. Did very well. A really amazing, interesting book to write about, boxing and racism in the 1980s, and even the involvement of gangsters and all that. And I got to meet the Richardson family, if you know them, the dread mortal enemies of the Krays. So that was fascinating. And then Neville Staple of the Specials. I got to meet the Specials, a group I absolutely adore, Scar Two-Tone band from late 70s, early 80s, and wrote his biography. And then, I segued into the Knights Templar. I've been writing about them really for 10 years, and there's three books I have out at the moment through a trilogy out through Pen and Sword, with the second book out now about the trials and tribulations at the end of the Templar story, and that's something that I'm finding very fascinating. But it's a subject that it keeps giving. I do a podcast as well on the Templars called Talking Templars on YouTube and various other channels. It runs also on medievalists.net, which I co-present with a guy called Dr. Steve Tibble, who hates all the conspiracy theory stuff about the Templars. So he and I pretend to joust about this, on our podcast episodes.
So another thing you've done is you've done a lot of TV. You have been on William Shatner's The Unexplained, Lawrence Fishburne's History's Greatest Mysteries. Recently, you've been on Lost Grail with Alice Roberts. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the Alice Roberts series was, is the most recent thing I've done. It was a real hoot. I mean, I have done a lot on the Templars. I was in Istanbul last year with German TV, looking at a story that the Templars stole the Shroud of Jesus from Istanbul, and I've done stuff, as you say, William Shatner's The Unexplained and Lawrence Fishburne's History's Greatest Mysteries. All of these are kind of history shows. The Alice Roberts thing was really interesting because she's a great historian, great person to film with. And her series was really her quest to find out, well, what is the truth about the Holy Grail? People talk about the Holy Grail. It features in fiction, the Arthurian romances. It features in Dan Brown. It features in Indiana Jones. But is there any truth to the idea that the Templars had the Holy Grail, and as well that the Holy Grail was here in England? Because there are these very curious medieval stories about Joseph of Arimathea, the uncle or great uncle of Jesus, coming to England with the Grail and burying it at Glastonbury and so on. So Alice was really trying to unpack all of that, and I met her in a couple of places on her journey around Britain, and that was called Lost Grail with Alice Roberts. Still out at the moment, and just great fun. But it never interest in the Templars never seems to diminish. I'm always being asked to do yet another documentary on the Templars, whether it's the Holy Grail or all the other mysteries around them. And actually, I'm writing another book which will come out later this year on the alleged connection between the Knights Templar and Freemasonry. So that's going to be that will be the end of my trilogy. But the current one, the one I'm talking about at the festival, is the brutal trials, the way that they ended, and that's something I've done as well, of course, for TV a lot. That topic.
Yes, yes. So what is it? Obviously, as you say, the Templars really, it just draws everyone back. There's something about them that people are really fascinated by. And obviously something that has fascinated you as well. What is it that you think that really draws us to these figures?
I mean, I think my interest in Templar history, medieval history, even is just, let's bring it back to Essex. There is stacks of medieval history in Essex. I mean, you can't, and East Anglia. Um, I was basically, I always say I was dragged around abbeys and ruins by my parents, but I wasn't dragged around. I loved it, and you've got places like Greenstead Church, where there's apparently supposed to be a Templar buried there. I'm not sure if it is, but this amazing woodlog church that's 1,000 years old, not far from where I grew up. You've got Thaxted with its amazing church. Um, but in addition to that as well, I'm also half Portuguese, and the Templars were very active in Portugal, fighting the Islamic Caliphate, which ruled southern Spain and Portugal. That was another crusade going on that sometimes people in England don't really know about. They know about the crusade in the Holy Land, but not in the Iberian Peninsula. And so the Templars, I kept bumping into the Templars, I think, growing up, either in East Anglia and Essex, or through my Portuguese heritage. So, and I just think that they're not just a dry topic from the Middle Ages. They're a very rich topic, and of course they've ingrained themselves in our culture. Sometimes fact, sometimes fiction, but disentangling that fact and fiction, of course, is part of the fun of investigating the Knights Templar.
Yes, yeah. I mean, with it being so long ago, it must be incredibly difficult to
Well, it's
unpick.
a funny one because they were like, the Templars, what existed between round about the year 1118 through to 1307, but they've never gone away. Um, and, our fascination with them, in fact, they've had this incredible afterlife. And this kind of started from early on. There were kind of lies and calumnies and gross accusations made against the Templars while they existed, but that's continued. And it's something I write about actually in the book Downfall of the Templars. Is you look at the novels of Walter Scott, Ivanhoe being an obvious example, right through to Star Wars, where George Lucas apparently was influenced by the Templars when he came up with the idea of the Jedi. In fact, he was even going to call them Jedi Templars apparently at one stage. But then, of course, and you've got Assassin's Creed, everybody's favorite video game. So the Templars are still with us. They just haven't gone away. They're sometimes goodies, they're sometimes baddies, but they're always there. And I think they're just unavoidable. So even though historically, strictly speaking, they're what 700-800 years ago, they are an element of the Crusades that are still with us. And everybody, you ask anybody, are you interested in the Templars? Anybody, in the office you work in, wherever, they always, oh yeah, 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 Templars, yeah. Didn't they have the Holy Grail? And went they into witchcraft and blah 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 blah. But people have this idea of them or different ideas about them, and it's as if I think they're still with us. They're both ancient and modern.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point actually. Um, so let's talk about the book Downfall of the Templars. Tell us it's about the end of the Templars. What happens to them? Obviously.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about the end of the Templars is the end of the Templars is, of course, a story in itself. I mean, I wrote one book called The Knights Templar History and Mystery, where I basically did the medieval timeline of the Templars from their origin to their fall. But I always knew that the second book would have to be specifically on the crushing of the Templars, the downfall, because it was such an unusual thing to happen. It was such an unusual incident. These guys, and they were mainly guys, were the kind of poster boys of medieval Christendom. They were the shock troops of the Crusades. They were renowned for their bravery and their courage, and they lived in this strange way as half monk, half priest, half monk, half soldier, because they observed the monastic rules of poverty, chastity, and obedience, though they weren't actually, strictly speaking, monks or priests. But they observed that, while at the same time they had a rule book that made sure that they were the bravest people on the battlefield, and they were a new concept in a way. They were a professional army that stayed put, in the war zone, while other knights went home to manage their estates. The Templars stayed put. So everybody thought the Templars were marvelous, but they're always whispering voices, jealous voices, especially in the church, that hated them. They're too rich. They're too privileged. Why does the Pope like them so much, etc.? And the whole thing erupts in 1307 when King Philip IV of France arrests all the Templars in France on these horrific charges of heresy, sodomy, basically kind of witchcraft, and of being traitors as well to the kingdom. And then he basically leans on a very compliant pope who's at that time exiled out of Rome and living in Avignon, which of course is very close to Paris. And so the king leans on the pope and says, right, I'm destroying the Templars here in France. You have to destroy the Templars throughout Christendom. They have to be crushed throughout the world. And what I'm investigating in this book is, why did it happen? And I have a particular idea about why it happened. Would you like to know it?
Yes.
Okay. Well, so the obvious reason is money. Money is always at the root of all evil. And King Philip IV of France at that time was fighting England. His exchequer was in a ruinous state. He already had gone after the Jewish community. He went after Lombard merchants. He went after the monasteries. And so he went after the Templars in the belief that, because the Templars were very involved in one of the ways that they raised money for their military activities was they were involved in essentially money lending, in managing people's money, running a kind of early bank check system, and so on. But what I say in the book is that it's not just about the money. There's something else going on here. And what I think we're seeing is the first of the witch trials. Now, you may think, what? But I'm telling you, there is a logic and there is evidence aplenty for this. And that is that when King Philip was going after the Knights Templar, at the same time, with the same prosecutors, in very much the same manner, he also went after, for example, a group of women preachers called the Beguines, one of whom was burnt at the same time in the same month that he burnt 54 Templars at one of the gates of Paris. He was also accusing a dead Pope, Boniface VIII, of being guilty of witchcraft and simony and heresy and so on. And he also, on top of that, he had the Bishop of Troyes on trial, accusing him of having poisoned the Queen to death. She'd actually died in childbirth. So Philip is pursuing a series of what I think we have to regard as basically witchcraft-related trials. Now, this is before the whole witchcraft mania takes over Europe. It's about 100 years before this happens. But already, witchcraft has moved from being, the elite looked at witchcraft as a kind of rustic medieval superstition. Even the church looked at witchcraft and thought, this is just a leftover of paganism. It's stupid. We'll just get priests, local priests to deal with it. If we have to dunk a witch in the local pond, so be it. But we're not going to get massively involved in this. But then in the 13th century, as the Catholic Church is actually reaching the peak of its power during the Crusades, you also get an eruption of rebellious, heretical movements against the church. People who say, you know what, the church shouldn't be about being, super wealthy, super rich, super powerful. And the church begins to sex up heresy charges by blending heresy charges with witchcraft. At the same time, they build the Papal Inquisition, which will become notorious, of course, in the later Middle Ages, early modern period. And they also start to allow inquisitors to use torture, for example. And they also hand over heretics to the secular arm to be burned to death. And so I think we have to look at the Templar trials in this context, that King Philip of France and Pope Clement are using this emerging anti-witchcraft infrastructure and ideology against the Knights Templar. And what happens to the Templars? They're burned at the stake. They're treated as witches. What are they accused of? They're accused of worshipping a demon called Baphomet. They're accused of worshipping cats. Does that sound familiar? And they're accused of engaging in pornographic, magical rituals behind closed doors. So we can see the kind of stuff that's going to become standard in witch trials being used against the Templars. And I think that's what's really, you've got to kind of see that reality is many-sided. Yes, Philip wants the money, but I think he's also buying into a lot of this emerging witchcraft, sorcery stuff. And we see, after he dies, we see subsequent kings of France become more and more seduced by this, and we see popes are obsessed by witchcraft, to the point that then in the following century you even have manuals being published on how to find a witch, how to deal with a witch, how to burn a witch, and so on. And then we get 300 years of crazy anti-witchcraft mania. But that is basically my thesis, and of course I bring up the supporting evidence in the book for that, for all you skeptics out there.
I mean, obviously, here in Essex, we have a very strong history of witch trials. Matthew Hopkins was quite active, and obviously the Manning Tree Witches. There's a wonderful play about it at the moment as well. So we have a lot of that history here, don't we?
You do, and Essex does have this. In fact, I think this is a book that my father got me from a jumble sale years ago. The fantastic little book, all about witchcraft in Essex. But yes, of course, there's been the recent TV series as well, and I think that Matthew Hopkins was what, in the 1600s. I mean, it just shows you how long this lasted for. This went on basically from the 1400s to the end of the 1600s. And it jumped the Atlantic into the American colonies, and we have the Salem witch trials and so on. And there is also, it's worth saying, increasing interest in witchcraft today. If you go to certain bookstores, Treadwell's, for example, on Store Street, there's a whole witchcraft section, because a lot of young people are getting very interested in the subject of witchcraft. So I think that for a lot of young people, this reappraisal of the Knights Templar, looking at what was going on around them, how they were put on trial, the things they were accused of. It's astonishing. They were accused of crucifying Christ a second time. These are guys who'd been fighting for Christ, who now were accused essentially of being necromancers, sorcerers, witches. And I think this is why as well they found it very hard to defend themselves. Because it's when you're being accused of stuff like this, where do you even start your defense? These are bluff soldiers who are dragged after being tortured as well in front of these, church commissioners, and they're sitting there going, well, I don't know what to say. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a theologian. I don't think I'm a witch, but okay, I'll sign it. Just don't put me on the rack again and break my feet and thumbs, So, people do sign these lurid confessions.
So it's quite interesting as well, because you were saying, just to come back to something you said earlier, you said that the Knights Templar were mainly men. Were there female Templars? Do we know about that?
So there are women who associate themselves. They're sometimes described as donatas. They're women who've given money to the Templars. Who I won't go as far as to say there are Templar nuns, but there are women who live, in kind of households adjacent to the Templars. And who support the Templars through prayer or through giving money. But it has to be said, we're talking about a 99% male order. This is a male military order. But they have tremendous support. And, we're saying there are leading women in medieval society. Matilda, for example, the Empress Matilda, who fights a civil war against King Stephen in England. Eleanor of Aquitaine, fantastic a fantastically powerful, enigmatic, charismatic woman in the Middle Ages. They are keen supporters of the Knights Templar. And maybe the appeal of the Templars to many, rich medieval women is that they weren't, the boozy, carousing, boorish, murderous average knight. They were disciplined. They didn't, they didn't have any relationships with women. They lived this monastic lifestyle, and maybe that appealed to some women who thought, well, at least these knights, have some kind of morality, some sort of principles, um, and they're not, basically hanging out with, the village prostitutes or taking this knights used to take basically a retinue of women, you know, to war with them, and treat women appallingly, as you can imagine. Whereas the Templars are, they're observing chastity. So, maybe that was an appealing point that they weren't the average boorish, savage, horrible medieval knight. Just a theory. I'm just floating that out there.
I think that's a good idea. Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're going to look a lot better than the the standard.
I think so. I think so, and I think that was, that's definitely one of the appealing things about the Templars. But of course, in the end, it counts for nothing. When the King of France comes to them. By the way, there's a lot of kings in Europe. King Edward II, the King of Castile, who, when they received the letter from the Pope saying you must crush the Templars, they just thought, what on earth? There's nothing wrong with the Templars. And in fact, in Portugal, in my mother's native Portugal, they didn't crush the Templars. They rebranded them. They renamed them the Order of Christ, and they kind of, under royal control, they kind of continued. Um, but throughout Europe, their lands were taken, their assets were seized. In France, a lot of Templars were burned to death at the stake. I mean, the worst way to be executed. And in 1314, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, Jacques de Molay, is burned at the stake with another leading Templar, because Jacques de Molay, having confessed under duress and under torture, then retracts his confession at the last minute and says, actually, you know what? No, I'd rather die, frankly, with honour. And he gets his wish. He's dragged in front of Notre Dame Cathedral on the Ile des Juifs. You can still see there's a plaque in Paris that marks a spot where he was burned to death. I think the plaque is hidden away a bit. I think the Parisians are still a bit ashamed of what they did to the last Templar Grand Master, but it is there on the Ile des Juifs, which is a little island adjacent to the Ile de la Cité, where Notre Dame is. But it's an ignominious end for the Templars, and it should have been the end of the story. But I think because of the way they were crushed, because of the things they were accused of, ironically, the King of France has given the Templars this massive afterlife that continues down to the present day. It explains why I'm addressing the Essex Book Festival.
Yes, and a little bit of fact versus fishing. Did any of this happen on Friday the 13th?
I think the what do you got? The warrants are served. Reasonably good reason to think that they were served on. So they're basically these warrants that have this lurid, appalling accusations against the Templars are they are issued secretly to constables around France in September 1307, and then served in October, Friday the 13th in October. Now, there's a whole kind of industry of speculation around whether or not the Templars knew those warrants were coming. Did some of them manage to escape? There's a whole kind of, and I look at this in this book and the next book about some of them manage to escape to Scotland? Did some of them manage to escape to Portugal? I have a chapter on each of those theories in this book. I mean, there's some crazy theories that some of the Templars got to Scotland and helped Robert the Bruce win at the Battle of Bannockburn. That's one theory that's out there. But I do look at those theories in depth, whether or not there were Templars who escaped, who got away, and did they take some of their wealth with them? And of course, if you go into the complete conspiracy realm, and I do look at this in the book as well, this whole thing about the Templars having got to America 100 years before Christopher Columbus, and evidence for that at Rosslyn Chapel. But I do explain all of that, and actually the surprisingly long roots of some of these theories going right back to the 16th century, and some of the conspiracy theories about Templars actually going back to the medieval period. People have been spinning stories about the Templars really right back to when they existed. So all of that is looked at in the book alongside the trial. So you get the full picture.
Oh, brilliant! Yeah, it sounds really, really interesting. There's so many ideas, and obviously, as you're saying, they've had this sort of long life in media, in movies, and in TV as well, where kind of a lot of these theories have been explored, even if they didn't happen. But one of my favourites, and I don't know if you have ever watched this TV show. It was on the BBC in around about, I don't know, 2006 or so. It was called Bone Kickers, and they had an episode. Their first ever episode was about the Knights Templar, and they found like a piece of the tunic, and then they also had some people who were the Templars today, and and they had this like dual storyline. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it is, if you ever want Templar things to watch, it's wonderful.
I didn't see both figures, but you touch on something there that I do cover in this book and the next one, which is Templars today. I mean, there are still people who call themselves Knights Templar. Some of them are what are called Neo-Templars, and this is a movement founded. I won't go into all of it, but I do cover it in the book actually. It was a movement founded by a French guy under Napoleon Bonaparte, and he claimed to be the latest in a long line of Grand Masters that continued secretly from. So Jacques de Molay is burned to death in 1314, but the theory is that Jacques de Molay nominated another secret Grand Master, and the Grand Masters continued in secret until this guy Bernard Palaprat, his name was, came out in the open in the early 19th century, and he founded what still exists. It's become a Neo-Templar movement. It's very fractious, though. There's now lots of groups claiming to be the real Templars. Then, in addition to that, you have, of course, the Masonic Templars and the Freemasons for the last 300 years who've claimed to be connected to the original Knights Templar. And so you have degrees within Freemasonry of Masonic Templars. And then on top of that, as if that wasn't enough, you have Roman Catholic Templars today. There's a group called Templars today, actually, Templari Oggi in Italy. I met them in Rome last year for dinner. Very interesting. And they are a Vatican recognized Templar organization who are trying to rehabilitate the Templars, essentially get them forgiven by the Vatican. And interestingly, they sometimes are given kind of guarding duties at the basilicas in Rome. And when J.D. Vance came to see Pope Francis last year, shortly before Pope Francis died, they actually, and you can see photographs of this online, they were actually providing bodyguard responsibilities around J.D. Vance. You see them in white tunics with a cross here. And these are guys who are like accountants and bank managers during the week, but then they become Templars, Catholic Templars at the weekend. So you've got these different types of Templars, people who passionately believe they are today's Templars and they are descended from the original Templars. Make of that what you will. I'm not connected to any of them, by the way, just in case anybody's wondering if I'm a secret Freemason or a clandestine Templar. None of that.
That's really fascinating. I had no idea that was true. They really are some. That's amazing.
There are thousands of them, by the way, if you count them all together, and they all hate each other. The Catholic Templars hate the Masonic Templars, hate the Neo-Templars. So they're a very fractious bunch, but of course they have that shared fascination with the Templars and what they believe the Templars stood for.
Yeah, which presumably is quite different for lots of different people.
It is, and as I say, the kind of second half of the book, I do deal with this kind of long tail of fascination with the Templars and go into these various, how the Templars survived in literature, in politics, in secret societies, subsequently. And right down to Dan Brown, of course, who has so much to answer for. But even I even cover there's I don't know if you know this, but Dan Brown was sued by a couple of authors who said that he had plagiarized their work. I mean, they lost the case, but it's a fascinating court case that I cover in the book where Dan Brown had to defend his Priory of Sion theory, this theory that the Templars were created by a secret organization called the Priory of Sion to protect the bloodline of Jesus, and that Rosslyn Chapel is involved, etc. This is the sort of stuff medieval historians hate with a passion, but of course it's worked its way into the whole Templar narrative. So I try and disentangle that, but also explain that fascinating court case, which, if you read the judgment, the judge clearly enjoyed himself immensely, going back and researching Templar history and all the books that have been written about it and the various clashes among, Templar fans that led to that court case. But yeah, it's they're still the Templars. They just will not go away. There's even horror movies, by the way. There's a whole genre of Spanish horror movies about the Templars. Should you wish to go and root those out, details in the book as well.
Oh, amazing! Yeah, this is such a rich and very, their influence really can't be overstated, can it?
No, I mean, and,
So
and like I said, in Essex we have the amazing Cressing, we have the amazing barns at Cressing Temple, which you can go see. I mean, they are intact because what one of the things the Templars did was they ran these, I call them agri-businesses all over Europe. They had these preceptories, which were basically generating cash out of farming, out of trading, and that cash was then funneled to the Holy Land. And you can see evidence of that in Essex at Cressing Temple. I advise anybody. I'm not working for the Cressing Temple Tourist Board, by the way, but anybody who's in Essex wants to understand the Templars, go to Cressing and to Witham, and you will see, real remains of the Templars. So you can be with the Templars today. You can see things that they saw. That's the amazing thing.
that is amazing. And another amazing historical location is Layer Marney Tower, which is where you're going to be for our History Books Day at Essex Book Festival. And it is the tallest Tudor gatehouse in England, which is pretty exciting. So you're going to be with us on Sunday, the 28th of June, talking about downfall of the Templars. What are you most looking forward to about that event?
What I really like about doing. I've just spent a month actually on a luxury cruise ship. I was condemned to go around Asia and Japan, giving talks to um, rich retired passengers. But what I love about anything like that, festivals, giving talks in any kind of venue, is the interaction with the audience. Because I think being an author can be a lonely business. You're there kind of sunk in the research, sunk in the writing, but to be able to kind of go face to face with people, and especially with a subject like the Templars, to get their perspectives of what fascinates them about the Templars. And I kind of love the whole kind of Q&A, and just knowing your audience, knowing your potential readers. Basically, you've got to do that as an author. And as you say, what a venue, just proving that Essex has these fantastic. I will not have Essex rubbished by non-Essex people. We have the best history, as you know. Great churches, great ruins, great stately homes, and this venue. It's, what is it? It's a Tudor skyscraper. Where do you get that in England, for God's sakes?
It is amazing. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And obviously, yeah, you're part of the History Books Day. We are also going to be hearing from Emily Hauser and Jonathan Friedland on the same day. So you're opening for us, and then we'll be hearing from them. We want people to come to the full day, right? Like, you've got to come and experience the whole thing.
God, yeah, and I mean, Emily Hauser. I know she's, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think her latest book is Mythica, which is incredibly well timed. I'm sure she's aware of that, but it's about the women in Bronze Age Greece at the time of Homer's Odyssey, and of course we have that movie coming out with Matt Damon and others. I believe it's coming out in July. Um, and there's going to be huge interest in the Odyssey, in Homer, and here's Emily with a very well timed book. And then I know Jonathan obviously has had a book out on the various conspiracies against the Nazis to try and overthrow the Nazis and who betrayed those. I just did a podcast recently um, on the Nazis who fled to Egypt. And by the way, if there's a topic that is a hardy perennial, you've got the Templars, but you've got the Nazis. And by the way, something I talk about in the book is the Nazi fixation on the Templars, and I talk about how they went on their own weird quest for the Holy Grail. They sent an archaeologist called Otto Rahn looking for the Holy Grail. He didn't find it. He ended up being sent to Dachau concentration camp as a guard and then was found murdered on an alpine hillside, but very suspiciously. So the Nazis, so obviously, I mean, you've got a winning formula here, if you don't mind me saying so, because you've got the Templars and the Nazis in ancient Greece as a film comes out on the Odyssey. I mean, anybody who doesn't go to this day needs their head seen too.
It is going to be a brilliant day, and it is very sadly for us, but also very excitingly, it is a final day of the month-long Essex Book Festival. So you are part of our grand finale. But we are hosting over 100 events over the month in 40 venues all across the county. So Essex Book Festival, it is quite different. It's not just a weekend in a tent. We're all over the place. It's quite a special and quite a different book festival. What do you think? What for you sort of stands out to you about the Essex Book Festival?
I think it's the fact that you're quite rightly. I mean, when I was invited, I was very genuinely excited because I love something that shows to the world that side of Essex that we know all about. It's fabulous history. It's great authors. It is culturally rich. Essex is a fantastically culturally rich place, and I think the Essex Book Festival really brings out that richness of culture of authors from Essex.
Thank you. Yes, no, that is very, very true. Thank you. We are really excited to have you with us, and we are really, really looking forward to the event. Thank you so much for speaking to me today, and I will say goodbye and let you carry on with your. I think you're recording another podcast soon, aren't you, about the Templars?
Yeah, we're working on 3 more episodes tomorrow. Myself, and my co-presenter of Talking Templars, which is on YouTube and Spotify. And medievalist.net. We're doing 3 episodes of Talking Templars tomorrow in this very room here. I wish we were recording it at the book festival venue, but we can't afford that, so we're going to be recording it here in my study. So.
Oh, that's wonderful. And yes, anyone who is interested, let them know where can they follow you online and listen to the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, if you look for Beardy History, Beardy History, you'll find me. But I have a blog, thetemplarknight.com. I have a more generalist blog, beardyhistory.com. And then actually, if you look for Beardy History on YouTube, you'll find me. But I'm here, there, and everywhere. I'm addicted to TikTok as well. You'll find me on there. Same thing, Beardy History. Go and have a look. I'm there.
Do you do the TikTok dances? Or?
No. I think no. I try and keep some self-respect. Not much self-respect, but just a bit more. But no. I leave that to the young uns to do.
Oh, thank you very much for speaking to me today, and thank you, and bye-bye.
Pleasure. Thank you.